Hello and welcome to Future of Film's Virtual Production Revolution, our special show on the future of filmmaking and the pioneers who are making virtual production a reality. I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of our supporters who have made this series possible. Epic Games and Unreal Engine, Brompton Technology, and Garden Studios in London, whose incredible virtual production stage I am now sat on. So that just leaves me to say thank you again for listening and watching, and I hope you enjoy this episode of Virtual Production Revolution. I wanted to start by asking you about how you did end up working in the virtual effects technology space in film and visual storytelling.
Yeah, I kind of grew up like a lot of people that are in this industry, just loving effectsy movies, and that was just sort of like the common thread between all the films that I loved, and that really clicked with me when I saw Jurassic Park, and I just saw that movie maybe 10 times in theaters and just really wanted to learn how to make dinosaurs. There's just something about making visuals that you couldn't make any other way, and using technology to do it. So I was going to a public high school in Seattle, and the one of the teachers there, he was a AutoCAD teacher. He also had a couple copies of 3D Studio Release 2 for DOS. And he said, "Well, you can't make dinosaurs with AutoCAD, but I got this 3D Studio program. I have no idea how to use it. Here's the manuals and a few parallel dongles. Like, go knock yourselves out." And so a buddy of mine and I, we just stayed at school making videos, first for, high school classes, and then for high school assemblies. And then we got a little job with a local company. And that led us to have a job with a big local company, which was Microsoft. And that kind of relationship between us and Microsoft and how the school had fostered that ended up landing us a spot in a documentary that just happened to be funded by George Lucas's nonprofit educational foundation. And George and his producer, Rick McCallum, saw us in the editing room of that documentary. This was in 1995, 1996. And, I get this call from Rick as a voicemail saying like, "Hey, my name's Rick McCallum. I'm producing this little movie you may have heard of called Star Wars Episode 1. Do you want to come down and visit Skywalker Ranch?" And that answer was had very quickly. So, we got a tour of the ranch, we got a tour of the art department, saw the first part. Previs was really, really new back then. And, even today, like, previs is a really sort of important part of the virtual production process, right? That it had really rarely or never been done on films before Star Wars Episode 1 that was sort of a leader in that. And we got to see some of the first previs on Episode 1, which was the pod race. And but they couldn't hire us at that point because we were juniors in high school. We still had one more year to go. So we made it our life's mission to prove to them that they had to hire us after we graduated high school. And so we made a video that was really similar to what we'd seen in the pod race, but not so similar as to get us sued. And it was a mix of live action and CG, and pretty fun. I mean, by these days standards, it's crude, but it was entertaining, and it was entertaining enough where they said eventually, "Stop bugging us with all this work in progress that you're sending us. You're hired, and show up for work 2 days after you graduate high school." So moved down to California, joined the previs team on Star Wars Episode 1, and the rest is kind of history.
Wow. It's a great story, and what a place to cut your teeth.
Yeah, it was pretty surreal.
I mean, incredible, like a fairy tale. But this is fascinating. But you basically self-taught, and that was before YouTube, right? Before there were all these videos on YouTube you could use to learn. How did you actually learn those skills?
It was that's a really good question. I think the way that we learn those skills is kind of the same thing that I see in common with a lot of the really extremely talented people that we see coming out of either hobbyists or colleges today, which is that we weren't learning the 3D software to get a job. We were learning it because we wanted to accomplish a thing, right? We wanted to create this visual or that visual, and just really got a lot of energy off of the notion that we could make something out of nothing, right? And so for me, diving in and learning, learning Premiere and 3D Studio, and then later it was Electric Image and FormZ and After Effects, and that the software just kind of keeps evolving. But the common thread is just like why I'm using the software, like what is my motivation, and always having that motivation to kind of guide me, even when it's like I'm confused about what button to press. Eventually the answer becomes clear, right? If I know why what my end result is, right? So that I think is the thing that allowed me to self-teach. And our little demo project from back in high school that got us a job on Star Wars Episode 1, it's actually, again, it's crude, but it's also still, it holds up against some of the stuff that I see coming out of colleges now, right? And I think that the difference between us then and the sort of the cream of the crop now is huge, right? They're so much better, but us then and everybody else, it's like it's not really that much of a difference, because even though technology is advanced, if people are using it for reasons that aren't like really driven by the visual, driven by the result, it's just, no amount of technology can like bring that out of somebody, right? So that's why I always tell people that are wanting to get into this industry is it's like, look, it's a nutty industry, but then also like, I think you need that sort of creative drive and this stubborn vision of creativity in order to like really succeed and be able to overcome challenges, aka self-teach, when the going gets tough.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Having that vision of the storytelling, I guess, and having that in mind to guide you through the use of the tools.
There's plenty of times where things like get really tough in movie making. I mean, it can be extremely chaotic. It's the only business that I am aware of where there's sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars at stake, and people are kind of winging it sometimes. And so that can get really stressful. For me, I started a visual effects company, I'm kind of fast forwarding a number of years, and ran that for, 8 or 9 years. And there were just moments of extreme stress. Like all this, gray hair is from that. And anytime I had to ask myself, like, why am I putting myself through this? There always had to be an answer, right? That was kind of like a real, like, soulful core default. And there still is. And if I didn't have that, I would be in another industry now.
Yeah, there's probably easier places to make a living, for sure. So I'm definitely drawn to geeking out a little bit about Star Wars and talking a bit about that, but I want to stay on topic. I mean, from your experience at the ranch, as they call it, working with George and the team on Episode 1, what were your key, I suppose, takeaways from that experience?
I got to work directly with George a few times a week in the cutting room. Our previous team was like six people at its smallest and like 10 at its biggest or something. So it was a very small team. So we were working directly with George and the editors, Martin Smith and Ben Burt. And, because I hadn't gone to film school, I didn't know what screen direction was. I didn't know, any of this stuff. But effectively what I was doing is through previs, they would take these, oftentimes it was like reels of like World War II footage, right? Or Vietnam footage or whatever, plane dogfights and stuff. And they would cut it together and then say, we want something like this, but like in space. And then we would have to extrapolate and figure out how to plus it up. and we would just make mistakes, and then the editors would be like, no, we screen directions left to right in the scene, and you cross the line here, and this, that, and the other. And slowly but surely we would sort of, like, it was a sort of a film school, like, on steroids, right? And that, that exposure to, like, the core of the filmmaking process was completely invaluable. And we, at the time, we didn't really realize how valuable it was and how unique it was. We kept chasing at that time, like, oh, we're doing these animatics that kind of look like crude video games, right? But they were the blueprint for the final shot. ILM followed what we did, oftentimes closer than they would have liked to. But Bob really, or George Lucas really saw it as sort of the roadmap. But so we were kind of like part of the filmmaking team, but we also were, like, so jealous of the people at ILM that they got to make the final pixels, that when their family went to see the movie, they're the final pixels, right? There's the dinosaur in Jurassic Park, there's the spaceship in Star Wars Episode 1. So we found ourselves constantly chasing, it's like, how can we get closer to making the final pixels? And we actually got fortunate enough to, we finished previs, and then they had us do a bunch of lightsabers and lasers, and we had to figure out how to make a lightsaber in After Effects, right? Back in, 1999. And so we kind of did all that stuff, and we got to make final pixels on the screen, and fell in love with it. But now, you fast forward, 10 years later, and I started looking back on those days going, like, I miss being part of the filmmaking process. Like, the final pixels is great from an execution perspective, but, like, I was making movies back then, and how can we kind of get closer to that? How can we get closer back to that? And that's one of the things that it started to really draw me towards virtual production.
Yeah, tell me about when you were first exposed to virtual production. Well, in fact, maybe start with how do you define virtual production, because people have different definitions of it.
Yeah. So there are lots of definitions of virtual production. Virtual production to me is really anything that brings parts of the filmmaking process that are traditionally outside the purview of visual effects into the digital process in a way that is extremely interactive, right? So basically using kind of visual effects tools and processes to help with things that are traditionally physical, like production design, the art department, costume even, certainly lighting and camera. Those things for many, many years were either extremely slow, and it was sort of, visual effects had kind of been this, like, process where there was hundreds of people on the other side of a black curtain that you just sort of, like, fed footage into, and maybe you got to talk to one or two people, that were sort of like, the people who had, like, yelled at the other side of the curtain, darker, bluer, right? And then 2 weeks later, the director would see the result of their direction. Whereas virtual production is really starting to is basically the process of, like, drawing back that curtain and exposing the traditional filmmaking departments to the virtual tools to help improve their process, right? So it's not just like LED walls or simulcam. It really extends much earlier than that, right? It's like, how do we work with the art department to make sure that their designs are going to suit the filmmaker's vision in the context of how they want to block the scene with their actors and their cameras, right? It's like a lot in, traditional days, you didn't really find out that stuff. I mean, you could use, like, little cardboard figures walking around in a foam core set, but that's about as far as you could get. With virtual production, we can, like, put, we can put actors in a fully virtual set with a virtual camera, even if it's a set we're going to build, months before they ever hammer a nail on that physical set. So yeah, and I think that the ultimate result of virtual production is that the director the desired outcome is for the director to get that much closer to actually being able to touch the final pixel in the movie. That's the purpose of it. And like Robert Zemeckis, who I've worked with for the last 15 years, his way of saying the same thing is he's like, yeah, virtual production is kind of like a printer that just prints what's in my brain, right? It's just like, it's like it helps to be that direct connection between what's in his head and he can actually physically manipulate cameras and lights and things in ways that he would have to have relied on a game of telephone of 10 people to do before he can just do it himself. And I think that's incredibly powerful.
So yeah, tell me about when you first experienced that, or was it a particular moment or project, or does it feel like more of a continuation in some ways from the work you were doing in previs early on?
I've kind of found that almost everything in the world of visual effects, and this is certainly true for virtual production, is an evolution of something else that happened before, right? And we kind of try something, just like in evolution in nature, the bad ideas, they might get you somewhere, but it's like we'd never want to do that again, right? And they just sort of fail and go by the wayside, and the good ideas are the ones that stick, and then you iterate and iterate and iterate. And so yeah, it's like back in 1997, working with the previs team on episode 1, is like, hey, we can establish a lot of what needs to go on with previs, but that was kind of like a dead end, right? That was like, it ended up in a bunch of fancy video footage, and that was it. But then as time went on, especially on Zemeckis's movies, because he's very open-minded to sort of using new technology, is on The Walk, we shot that in like 2014, and it was one of the first uses on film of simulcam, where you would look through the lens of the camera and see a giant green screen void of like a wire walker on a wire in one monitor, and then on the other monitor it was like a cityscape and a horizon in the background that would move in tandem with the camera. And and that hadn't been used at that scale before, but it was an incredibly helpful tool on that project. And then we did a movie called Allied, where we had a bunch of car driving work, and we needed to look like we were driving through Moroccan cities, but we had to shoot it in London. So we built one of the first sort of automotive like LED walls that didn't give us in-camera comps, but it gave us all the light and reflection on the these period World War II period chrome cars, or chrome accented cars. And then we had uses on Welcome to Marwen for having motion capture real time with simulcam and doing pre-lights on all of our sets, because we were actually using live action footage of the actors' faces to paste onto these dolls to make them, to make them look not creepy. And that required, a heavy involvement from the DP and the production designer, right? And so, now we're working on Disney's Pinocchio, and we're using every one of those technologies bundled together, right? And so it's sort of like every movie has had a reason to use and advance parts of the virtual production tool set, but it's always been like just the thing that's right for that movie. It's not like, hey, let's go full virtual production just because it's fun. It's like, no, this stuff is too hard and too expensive just to do it because it's fun or because it was the trendy thing. It's like, why are we using it? What are we using it for? What's the intended outcome? How does the filmmaker like to work? And then we decide what bits to use. And it just so happens that a movie like the one I'm working on right now is a great had great use cases for a lot of it. But we combine it all, and we learn things about each individual one. In the next movie, we may just use like a couple bits of the virtual production toolkit, but they'll be even further refined, right? So yeah, it's like it's definitely been an evolution and kind of driven by what makes sense, more than the technology itself, I guess.
Yeah, that does make complete sense. A series of interrelated tools which can be, you know, used together for particular use cases.
Yeah.
Your first movie with Robert Zemeckis, am I right in saying that was A Christmas Carol?
Yeah, that was A Christmas Carol. Did like a teeny bit of work on Beowulf as we were getting started up, but yeah, Christmas Carol was the first film that we worked together, and that kind of was born out of. So Bob Zemeckis had worked a lot with Doug Chang, as his sort of production designer, art department, like his concept team, and Doug happened to also have run the art department on Star Wars Episode One, and so I'd been, we were all on the third floor of the main house on Skywalker Ranch, and we were, these little energetic punks running around, just like jaw on the floor with all the art that they were making, and really took their inspiration and and put it, into these animatics. So when Bob Zemeckis came to Doug and said, "Hey, Disney wants me to start up this big motion capture company to do A Christmas Carol and movies beyond. Can you help me head it up?" And Doug said, "Sure. Like I can build a team." And so he called myself and a bunch of other people that he'd worked with before and said, "Do you want to do this?" And I said, "Well, yeah. I mean, I was at at a company called The Orphanage at the time and looking for sort of my next thing, and it was like the opportunity to work with the guy who did Back to the Future and Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Forrest Gump. It's just like I'm in, right? It was too good of an opportunity to pass up.
Does the work on Christmas Carol, was that in any way, are there continuations of that in terms of virtual production, or was that a different kind of workflow?
Yeah, it was a workflow that, it was certainly a continuation of some of the work that we had done, um, as individuals coming in. Like all the leadership at that company kind of brought their own ideas and their own experience to the table. Bob also had, he had a process that he'd kind of started to really gel with, from Polar Express through Beowulf, and so it was sort of like, all right, how can we take the best of everything that we know and facilitate the workflow that Bob wants, which is mocap and then do the cameras later and then refine into animation, being as faithful to the performances of the actors as we possibly can. So we invented a lot of new tech, and A Christmas Carol was a pretty painful show, because we were building a studio from the ground up while making a movie using a bunch of new technologies and processes. And at the time, we were still using, Motion Builder, to do all the real time work, and camera layout, things like that. Our DP Robert Presley was heavily involved in sort of, he had a set of airy wheels that were fed into the that were fed into the computers so that he could animators would animate cameras and then he would do a wheels pass on them to get them a little life. So it was, we were using virtual production there, um, but again, it was sort of like the right parts for the right moments. And a lot of the technology of these giant LED walls and stuff like that wasn't necessary because it was a motion capture thing.
Yeah, makes sense. Very Sounds very stressful as well.
Yeah, it
Uh,
was it was pretty stressful, but we had a great team to do it. So, and if there's nothing else that I got out of that experience, and we did make a movie that a lot of people watch and love, which is always amazing. Um, it's like the people that I met at that place, because it was like at its peak it was like 700 people or something, and now today I still work with a bunch of them. My producer Sandra Scott I work with back there, and our virtual production supervisor on Pinocchio, John Root. I worked with him there. He was part of the mocap team. And so, it's just sort of like, yeah, meeting great people. I mean, it's sort of one of the sort of underappreciated parts of filmmaking. As insane as things are, the insanity kind of helps bring out bonds in people, and those are relationships that, like, I definitely value, probably even more than the work that we do sometimes.
Let's talk a little bit about real-time technology, and we haven't touched on that yet. When did that sort of start entering your sort of field of work and influence, and how central is that really now in terms of where these tools and workflows are going?
So real time kind of like has slowly come into the picture. I mean, obviously on A Christmas Carol, we were using Motion Builder to help set cameras and sort of visualize where our motion capture actors were going to end up in the virtual sets. But it was a very heavily like physically based process, and obviously didn't look very good. And
is that sorry, Kevin? Is that I'm not familiar with Motion Builder. Is that an engine or?
Yeah, so Motion Builder is an application that at the time, I think at one point Autodesk bought it. I think they still own it, but it's like, it was an animation program that just was really well equipped to have like motion capture data streamed into it, and then you can manipulate it from there. And it still is great for that from a flexibility perspective. But it, so it renders in real time, but in the way that like Maya's viewport renders in real time, it doesn't look much better than that. Certainly not like the modern Maya viewport. So we were running without shadows and lighting and this, that, and the other. It looked pretty rudimentary, but it was enough to kind of get the gist of it. And the same was kind of true on the walk when we were doing this sort of real-time simulcam, where when we moved the camera, plus or minus, most of the camera moves on that movie were quite slow, so we could deal with some lag. And I think at the time it was like 12 or 13 frames between when you moved the camera and when you saw this sort of real-time render of our set with 1970s New York behind it move. But it was a really helpful compositional tool. And again, it didn't really look that great, but it was extremely helpful. And then we did Allied, where we had all this car driving stuff that we needed to use these giant LED walls for. It was like 100-foot long kind of U-shaped LED wall that was 8 feet high surrounding the actors and the cars. And that was a mix of sort of pre-rendered CG footage and 360-degree kind of stitched video that we'd filmed off of hood mounts on a car. And we were using a program called Touch Designer to kind of like drive that footage, and you could put up a blue square in the frustum of where the camera was seeing, to make kind of a virtual blue screen behind the actors, and run footage slower, faster, this, that, and the other. But so even though that was sort of more video footage based, the thing I actually started to notice is like, Brad Pitt came up to me and was just like, dude, that's awesome. Like, when I'm driving, like I can see when the corner's coming and steer at the right time. And I can look through the corner in a way that like is really hard to act, but like all this footage makes it easy. Right. And I love it. And so the interesting thing is just to see that even though that stuff wasn't like inherently, 3D in its malleable sense, because it looked real, people started to engage with it, right? They started to engage with it in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. And then leaping forward to Welcome to Marwen, because, we had this need to film our actors so that we could use their faces. The lighting had to really be established in what the final scene was going to be lit like. Like, this movie, required us to like put you know, a bunch of actors, um, their faces onto these virtual dolls in a virtual environment of like an overscale uh, kind of Belgian World War II town that the hero character of the film builds in his backyard. And so it's like everything is out of scale. We didn't want to do it Honey, I Shrunk the Kids style. We knew that the worlds had to be fully virtual, but in order for any of it to work, because we're kind of locked into the footage of the faces of our actors, we had to know what the lighting design of every set was going to be before we went and filmed it. Because if we lit an actor from the left and then they really should have been lit from the right, and then, you know, just the footage would have been unusable, right? And so that was my first experience diving into Unreal. And we gave our DP, C. Kim Miles, we gave him some tools to help him adjust sun angle and height and things. And that was the first time that in a real time 3D setting, I'd seen things actually starting to look like realistic enough where you see the DP start to engage, you see the director start to really engage. It's not just a tool that helps to kind of give information, but now I'm kind of making a real thing here, right? And you know, fast forward to like, you know, the movie I'm working on right now and Unreal, you know, with 426 and, you know, assuming you got an RTX card, like all the real-time ray tracing stuff and the GI, and it's like all of a sudden you're looking at something going like, I can really see the final movie in what I'm doing right now, right? Even though the animation is going to be better and the, you know, everything is going to be slightly better, it's like you can squint your eyes and go like, that's a movie. And in doing that, the real time has kind of evolved to the point where like people that didn't really, you know, looking at a very basic image and making the mental leap to what that's gonna look like, because they don't have exposure to the process prior, and they don't know what it is like to have a wireframe that comes out looking like something, that mental leap of like, oh, this is going to look like this, like they just don't have that experience. I kind of didn't really understand at the time, but it's like there was a reticence there to dive into it, and I think it's just intimidating, right? Where it's like I'm pushing a button here, but I don't know what's going to happen on the other side, and I get that now. Like I get that that was intimidating, whereas now with the state of, you know, tech, especially the stuff that I'm seeing from the Unreal team, there is no mental leap between what they see and what they're going to get. It's just like it's just so good that the quality of the image is not, it's not about being good just to look snazzy. It's about being good to engage that part of your brain that, you know, wants to iterate, wants to be creative, wants to have every input that you give have an instant result that then you can make a decision based off of. And that's what the real time tech is giving us now. So it's evolved dramatically, not just in how good it looks or how fast it moves, but how it's able to engage um, filmmakers that have decades worth of experience to give to the process, like enabling them to actually contribute at the highest level in the digital process.
That's really fascinating. So do you see then? Let's talk a little bit more about that process and how you see that changing, or how you see that sort of evolving. Um, does this mean, Kevin, that we have to? It's a case of deciding everything up front, because that's the other side of this. Is that because everyone's, you know, collaborating at an early stage. Uh, Bob Zemeckis is able to print his ideas, and everyone can sort of interact with that and contribute as well. But does that, you know, does that mean everything has to be set up front, or is it more flexible?
You know, it depends, right? I think one of the exciting things about virtual production right now is that everybody's still figuring out how to use it, right? Or how to, and by it, I just mean sort of the grab bag of tools that virtual production provides. It is, you know, I kind of feel like where where let me see, how do I put this? Like the trends, the things that are getting people excited about how to use it, these LED walls and things like that, I think are they're great inspiration, right? They're great inspiration for people to sort of like want to investigate the technology. I think that we have a lot of growth in terms of people, the soft side of things. And I'm kind of dancing around this answer because it's like, I don't want any of this to sound like a dig, but it's like, it's all so new that there are very few people in the world that know how to put together the right mix of tools and technology and have production experience, right? Because surviving on a movie set, and there's a reason why I use the word surviving, because it is like, usually it is a case of like, either you're going to make it or you're not, right? And it's such a fast-paced environment. There's a particular language that's spoken on set. There's protocol and etiquette that has its roots in hundreds of sort of man years of history in any one department. I mean, there's, movie making's been around for over 100 years now. So it's like there's a lot of stuff that's been established that we, as a virtual production team, oftentimes come from a games background or a visual effects background, but as any visual effects artist who has spent the first 15 years of their careers like in a studio can attest to, that then end up on a set, it's extremely intimidating, right? So now what we're doing is we're bringing this tool set to the process that is incredibly liberating. But if you're not speaking the same language as the rest of the filmmaking team, you're going to have a hard time, right? Breaking through. So I think a lot of the growth that we kind of have to do now in the virtual production world is sort of an education of like, all right, we're kind of like in a pretty good place with a lot of the tech. How can we help integrate that? What are the right times to integrate that tech into the production process? And how do we not just visually relate with all the other departments that can use this stuff, but how do we, from a communication perspective, how do we get the information out of them that they need to give us to help us give them what they need, right? And that that is it's a lot easier said than done. And there's a lot of, especially with as in demand as virtual production is right now, there's a lot of people doing this for the first time out there and learning trial by fire. And I've been there. It's hard. But to anybody who's listening that is that's in that boat, keep it up. There's people on the physical production side, they can be hard asses. There's a way that they've been doing things for a long time. A lot of people don't like to have that way being changed or upset by in any way. But when we do break through, it's pretty epic. Like it really changes things for the better. So it's a worthy struggle, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, that sounds good. Where do you when you're speaking to filmmakers, storytellers, people in the creative process, what do you what do you find people sort of the main challenges or hurdles people need to get over, or not need to get over, but are confronted with when dealing with some of these tools?
I think that, well, so they're all the creative challenges that are the usual things in production, right? Where it's like, how's this set gonna look like? It's one thing looking at a blueprint, but what's it gonna look like when I'm in a real world? And sometimes you can give a director, you can build it in a virtual production process, you can give the director a virtual camera, and they can scout it using real lenses and a virtual camera. Sometimes you can put a VR headset on them and they'll respond to that. Sometimes, going back to what I was just talking about with like, how do we facilitate this process, with the live action teams, in a successful way. Sometimes it's a matter of, if there's a production designer that, has an idea and they want to pitch it to a director, it's a great way to do that, right? So I think it's a great way to sort of overcome those kinds of sort of traditional challenges that, like even in the physical process, there's a lot of times there's sort of like a translation barrier between one department and the director, right? That said, it kind of brings up a good point that this is one of the logistical barriers to the success of virtual production is oftentimes when there's a particular department on a film that is sort of like, kind of like everybody's has to buy in, right? And if there's a particular department on the film that maybe we're not asking them the right questions, maybe we're not providing them the right tools, maybe they're just like, this is their last movie that they're doing and they just want to do it how they've always been doing it, right? But if there's one department that we can't quite break through to, you'll end up with a situation where there's a set design that everybody worked really hard to like build virtually, and the director scouts it with a virtual camera and makes some notes, and then all of a sudden you end up on set and you're doing your virtual set extensions, right? In the blue screen, you've only built a partial set and you're doing your set extensions, but unbeknownst to you, the art department has gone and changed a bunch of the design and not fed it back into virtual production because they were like, we got the information we need out of this, and not fully understanding the whole process. Now you're on set and your set extension doesn't line up with the real set because that change never came back to you, right? And so there are, I think, scenarios in which, even in the instances where it's useful, it can actually turn sour pretty quick, unless everybody kind of like really buys into it, and the virtual production team is doing a good job of sort of educating the physical departments on and hearing them and providing them with the tools they need too. So it's not, it's like it's not just about fulfilling the creative needs. It's sort of like an end-to-end challenge, right? It's like it could fulfill a creative need, but then be just as harmful or maybe useless down the line, if it's not holistically sort of like working within the jive of the, within the flow of the production, right? And I think that's like one of the really big challenges with virtual production. It's not just us nerds that need to be educated. It's, and I use the term nerds extremely lovingly, but it's also like everyone else, right? That is sort of ultimately the beneficiaries of the process.
Yeah. And is that being driven, like mediation in a way? Is that being driven by the virtual production team? Is that their role? Because they need to be quite empowered, don't they, in order to make that change and have that sort of It's a tough thing. I mean, ultimately, everything comes down to the director, right? And whether the director is embracing it, the director and the producers, because there are definitely times where, a virtual production process, like let's say the classic example is simulcam, right? Where it's like you want to see a set extension through the lens of your physical camera, or a virtual character through the lens of your physical camera. Oftentimes, it requires, regardless of what technology you're using, it requires putting a bunch of extra gack on the camera, right? You have to put, a tracking device of some sort, whether it's markers or a beacon. You have to put, usually it's like, extra time code box. You got to put a locket box on there, and you got to do this, that, and the other. And there's more cables in the loom, and so it's just more shit, right? and the camera team is oftentimes under the gun because the DP will be like, oh, now we need to go and we need to undersling this camera and mount it upside down because we need to get really close to the ground. Well, now you need to take all that gack off, put it all back on, and be ready with the camera to roll.
by the time the director's done with his rehearsal. Well, all of our virtual production stuff that's on the camera makes it that take more time, right? And so you'll end up with instances where the virtual production process, it does introduce inconveniences and slowdowns in the process. And so we have to constantly work to like make those faster. But and the payoff is there for the director, but it's not there for the first AC, right? The payoff isn't there for the first AC. They get nothing out of it, right? And most of the time, sometimes it'll help with like where to pull focus to and stuff, but most of the time it brings nothing to them. So that's why it's got to come from the director and the producers, where it's like when these slowdowns are happening, that they're there supporting the process and saying like, hey, I know this is adding one more thing for you, but it's really worth it for me, right? And it's worth it for the filmmaking process. And so it's got to come from up top. And slowly but surely, we'll make the inconveniences less inconvenient for people, and the tech will evolve to the point where it's hopefully quite transparent. But it's not there yet. So we as a sort of a visual effects team that's sort of driving the technology, we just have to be on top of figuring out how to reduce the impact, and how to make contingency plans for when it doesn't work, right? There are times where the engine will crash, right? And so and then you have blank LED walls, right? And if the DP is using the LED walls to light his set, you got a problem, right? And so but I've seen teams do brilliant things. It's like, well, I'm going to take what I'm going to output to the LED wall, and I'm going to record it, right, to an offline recorder, so that if the engine crashes, then I can just flip to the recording and the playback, so the LED wall doesn't go black. It's not interactive anymore, but it's not black, right? So I think that finding the shortcomings and limitations of the virtual production tools and making failure less noticeable on set is one of the things that actually makes the difference between a really good virtual production team and one that kind of draws the ire of traditional filmmakers.
Yeah. So, Kevin, where do you see all of this going? To sort of conclude, where do you see the future of virtual production? And is this now satisfying, I guess, going back to your early experience, is this satisfying your desire, your urge to be more involved, more hands-on in the storytelling, the filmmaking?
Yeah, I mean, I see virtual production going in a direction where it will become more transparent, where people won't notice the inconveniences of the requirements to do it as much. I think studios will get more and more used to and see the value in doing more upfront, right? Where we have to design our sets, and we have to we have to really kind of think about things that normally we would have been able to kick down the road into post earlier. And not only that, but we have to pay for them to happen earlier, right? So from a cash flow perspective, it's like things that a studio is used to being able to wait for until post-production to say, okay, now we're going to commit to spending the money on this environment because we know that it's in the movie, because we've seen a rough cut of the movie. Now they have to commit to that, at least a portion of that spend when all they have is a script, right? And so there's some mindset shifts that are happening, and most studios, I'm seeing them really buy into that. Disney's a great example. Working with them right now, it's like Dave Terratero is our visual effects executive on the show, has been so supportive of that, and we've learned a lot from it. And what it means is that the first time that the studio actually sees the movie, it's really fleshed out, right? So it's not a kind of a mental leap. It actually looks like a movie, right? Because we've done so much work up front, and the virtual production has informed the actual shoot, right? So I think that we'll continue to see that paradigm shift where really what it means is there's like not prep and shoot and post. It's just kind of like it's all just one thing that happens at the same time, and the principal photography is somewhere in the middle of it all. But it really is sort of like the one process, and um, and I think that different filmmakers will adapt um, different ways of using it. You'll find uh, more empowerment of a smaller team to really impact the outcome of the creative on the film. And with the amount of content that's being produced these days, you you have to do more with fewer people, right? You have to do more with less. And virtual production is absolutely going to take us there. And I think it will. It's like this is why like I sometimes get eye rolls from people when I say, like for decades, um the the fun thing about visual effects was like, oh, I've never seen a digital human before. Oh, look, Digital Domain did a digital human for Benjamin Button. Isn't that amazing? Nobody's done like digital water before. Oh, look what ILM did for Poseidon, or whatever it is, right? There's always been like a thing that we'd never seen before. And now we've kind of seen everything, right? We've sort of seen a version of everything, um, which for a couple years was depressing to me. Now it actually makes me realize that it's like it was never really about technically achieving that thing that had never been seen before. It's about how that thing allowed us to tell a story, and the story is actually the thing to get excited about. And so in a way, virtual production and the process, right, the impact it makes on the filmmaking process is actually going to allow filmmakers to tell stories that would have otherwise been untellable, right? Because they're going to be able to articulate their vision and really influence their vision in a way that would have been too expensive, too slow, too hard to explain, whatever the thing is, before. So in a way, like process is the sexiest thing because it is the thing that allows the filmmaker to be a filmmaker, and to use this tech to tell stories. And so that's kind of where I see virtual production going is lower and lower friction, um, to being the thing that allows the director to like directly express their vision onto the screen, and also involve their trusted collaborators in doing that same thing. So yeah, it'll be a fun journey to see for the next few years, certainly.